Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When my parents sold our childhood home without telling me to pay off my sister's debt, I stayed quiet. They said, "She's struggling, you'll understand." And I did, until the closing meeting, where I showed up with a surprise that no one saw coming. By the end of this story, you'll see how I turned the tables on a situation that was never supposed to be my responsibility. It was a chaotic Tuesday afternoon at work, the kind of day where meetings blurred into one another and my to-do list only seemed to grow longer. I was already teetering on the edge of exhaustion when my phone buzzed. It was my mom. She never called during the day unless it was urgent. So I excused myself, stepped into the hallway, and answered. "Hey, sweetie," she began, her voice tinged with an unusual hesitance. "Do you have a minute?" I glanced at the clock, already dreading the pile of emails waiting for me. But something in her tone made me stop. "Yeah, what's up?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Finally," she said, "there's something we need to tell you. Your dad and I have decided to sell the house." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. "Wait, what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "The house," she repeated, softer this time. "We're selling it. It's time." I stood there, trying to process her words. Our house wasn't just any house. It was the house. The one where my childhood lived. It was where my dad had painstakingly built a treehouse for my sister, Claire, and me, where my mom's laughter echoed through the kitchen as she baked cookies every Friday. Every birthday party, every lazy Sunday morning in pajamas, every hard conversation over dinner. It had all happened there. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "Why now?" Mom hesitated, and I heard a faint shuffle in the background before she answered. "It's Claire," she said finally. "Claire. Of course." My sister had always been the wild card of the family, brilliant but reckless, constantly teetering on the edge of chaos. Her financial troubles were no secret, but I had no idea they'd gotten bad enough to warrant something this drastic. "She's in a tough spot," Mom continued, her voice heavy with worry. "She got in over her head again, and she's at risk of losing everything. Your dad and we didn't see any other way to help her." "You didn't see any other way but selling the house?" I asked, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. "You didn't think to talk to me first?" There was a pause, and then she sighed. "We knew you'd be upset, but Claire is struggling. She needs us, and we thought you'd understand." I didn't know how to respond. On the one hand, Claire was my sister, and I loved her. But on the other hand, the house wasn't just a house. It was our family's history, the foundation of our memories, and the idea of losing it, of losing that piece of us, was unbearable. I don't know what to say," I finally stammered. "This is a lot to process." "I know," Mom said gently. "Take your time. But please, try to understand where we're coming from. Claire needs us, and we have to do what we can to help her." She hung up before I could say anything else, leaving me standing in the hallway, phone still in hand, as the weight of her words sank in. The house was going to be sold, not to downsize, not to move closer to retirement dreams, but to bail Claire out of another mess. As I walked back to my desk, my mind raced with questions. How bad was Claire's situation? What kind of debt could possibly justify selling something so precious? And why hadn't they thought to involve me in the decision? One thing was certain. This wasn't just about the house. It was about trust, about family, and about the unspoken dynamics that had quietly shaped our lives for years. And as much as I wanted to stay out of it, I knew I couldn't. Not this time. The call with my mom haunted me for the rest of the day. I couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't focus during meetings, and even the background hum of office chatter felt grating. As soon as I got home that evening, I called my parents back. I needed answers, real answers, and I wasn't going to let them sidestep the conversation this time. When Mom picked up, her voice was cautious, like she'd been expecting this call. "Hi, sweetie," she said. "Are you okay?" "Not really," I admitted, cutting straight to the point. "I need to understand this, Mom. Why are you selling the house? And why didn't you tell me sooner?" There was a long pause, and I could hear her take a deep breath before answering. "It's for Claire," she said finally, her tone soft but firm, like that explained everything. I leaned against the counter, gripping the phone tightly. "For Claire? What does that even mean? What's going on?" Another pause, this one heavier. Then, my dad's voice came on the line. "Your sister's in trouble," he said bluntly. "She's racked up a lot of debt, credit cards, loans, you name it. She's behind on everything, and if we don't step in, she's going to lose her apartment. It's a mess." I rubbed my temples, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't the first time Claire had gotten herself into financial trouble. but I had no idea it had gotten this bad. How much are we talking about? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Enough, Dad said grimly. Enough that selling the house is the only way to cover it all and give her a fresh start. I felt a surge of anger and frustration. And you didn't think to tell me any of this? You didn't think I deserved to know before making such a huge decision? We didn't want to burden you, Mom said quickly. You've got your own life, your own responsibilities. And Claire? Well, she's struggling. We thought it was best to handle it ourselves. By selling the house? I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. Our house? The one place that means more to this family than anything else? We know it's hard, honey, Mom said, her voice trembling slightly. But what else could we do? Claire's drowning, and we couldn't just sit back and watch her lose everything. She's your sister. You understand that, don't you? I didn't answer right away. On one hand, I did understand. Claire was family, and family was supposed to look out for each other. But on the other hand, selling the house felt like a betrayal, a choice that prioritized Claire's mistakes over the history and stability of our family. Does Claire even know what you're doing for her? I asked finally. She does now, Dad said. At first, she didn't want us to step in. She was embarrassed, but she didn't have a choice. She's in too deep. I couldn't decide if I was angrier at Claire for getting herself into this situation or at my parents for enabling her. This wasn't the first time they bailed her out, but it was by far the most extreme. And you think selling the house is going to fix everything? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. What happens if she screws up again? What happens when she burns through whatever help you give her this time? We're hoping this will be different, Mom said quietly. She's promised to get her life together, to take this second chance seriously. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But Claire's history made it hard to have faith in her promises. And the idea of sacrificing something as significant as the house for a gamble on her turnaround felt like too much to ask. I ended the call feeling even more unsettled than before. My parents seemed so convinced that this was the only solution, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be another way. Selling the house felt too drastic, too permanent. Later that night, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring at an old photo album I'd pulled from the shelf. It was filled with pictures of birthdays, Christmas mornings, and lazy summer afternoons in the backyard. Every memory was tied to that house, and the thought of losing it felt like losing a piece of myself. But what could I do? My parents had already made up their minds, and Claire's situation seemed too dire to ignore. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore. If I wanted to protect what mattered most, I'd have to find a way to get involved, whether my family wanted me to or not. I stayed silent for what felt like an eternity after my dad's final words, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me like a heavy fog. My mind screamed with 1,000 arguments, questions, and accusations, but I swallowed them all. Fighting wasn't going to solve anything, not in that moment. If you think it's the right thing to do, I said finally, my voice measured and even, then I guess I understand. It wasn't entirely true, though. Deep down, I wasn't sure I did. As I ended the call, I felt a strange mix of resignation and anger bubbling under the surface. The decision had already been made, and nothing I said was going to change it. But that didn't stop the knot of frustration in my chest from tightening. The following weeks were a blur of avoidance. I didn't call my parents again, and I ignored the text Claire sent my way. She must have known that I was upset, but she didn't push. I wasn't ready to face her, and honestly, I wasn't sure I could keep my frustration in check if I did. I poured myself into work, using the busyness as a convenient excuse to stay disconnected. But no matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, the situation with the house loomed large in the back of my thoughts. Every memory of that place, every laugh, every argument, every milestone seemed to replay in my mind on a loop. Eventually, I started asking myself a question I couldn't ignore. Was this really the only way? Selling the house felt so drastic, so final. Surely there had to be another option, one that didn't involve sacrificing something so important to our family. That's when I started digging. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, more of a need to make sense of the situation. I wanted to understand exactly what was happening, what the terms of the sale were, and whether my parents had fully considered their options. The more I looked into it, the more uneasy I felt. For one, the timeline for the sale seemed rushed. My parents had accepted an offer almost immediately after putting the house on the market, which struck me as odd. The house was in a desirable neighborhood, and with the right strategy, it could have fetched a much higher price. I also found out that the buyers were a real estate investment firm notorious for lowballing desperate sellers. They specialized in snapping up properties at below-market prices, often targeting older homeowners who weren't savvy about the true value of their homes. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened. My parents, desperate to help Claire, had been pressured into a bad deal. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not at my parents, necessarily. They were just trying to do what they thought was best for Claire, but at the buyers for taking advantage of their vulnerability. And if I was being honest, I was angry at myself too. I'd stood by quietly, unwilling to rock the boat, and now it felt like I was watching our family history slip away piece by piece. That's when it hit me. I couldn't just stand by anymore. The decision might have been made, but the sale wasn't final yet. There was still time to act if I could figure out how. The idea of getting involved felt daunting, especially since I wasn't sure how my parents would react. But I knew I couldn't let my fear of confrontation stop me. This wasn't just about the house. It was about standing up for what mattered, even if it meant going against my family's wishes. Over the next few days, I started working quietly behind the scenes. I reached out to a friend in real estate for advice, combed through public records, and even set up a meeting with a financial advisor to explore my options. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I didn't have a fully formed plan yet, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let the house go without a fight. My parents might have made their decision, but I wasn't convinced it was the right one. And if there was even a chance to change the outcome, I was going to take it. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I didn't know what the next step would be, but I was determined to figure it out, no matter what it took. The day started like any other. A sluggish morning commute, a quick stop for coffee at my usual spot, and the vague hum of frustration lingering in my chest over the house situation. I was scrolling through emails on my phone, barely paying attention to the line in front of me, when a voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "Is that really you?" I glanced up and was met with a familiar face. It was Rachel, an old college friend who had once been my roommate. We hadn't seen each other in years, but her warm smile and easy demeanor immediately brought back memories of late-night study sessions and inside jokes that no one else understood. "Rachel, wow, it's been forever," I said, genuinely surprised and happy to see her. We exchanged pleasantries while we waited for our orders, quickly catching up on the basics: work, life, and the general chaos of adulthood. When I mentioned my family's decision to sell the house, her eyebrows shot up. "Wait, is it the house on Elm Street?" she asked, leaning in slightly. I nodded, a little startled that she seemed to know exactly what I was talking about. "Yeah. How do you know?" "I'm in real estate now, remember?" she said with a grin. "Elm Street is a hot property. Everyone's talking about it. It's one of those neighborhoods where houses don't stay on the market for long. If the buyers are who I think they are, though, you might want to tread carefully." Her tone shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "They've got a reputation for lowballing sellers, especially older homeowners who might not know the true value of their property. They're good at rushing deals and making it seem like sellers don't have other options. It's not illegal, but it's shady." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. My parents weren't real estate experts, and they'd admitted to rushing the process to help Claire. It sounded like they'd walked straight into the kind of deal Rachel was describing. "Are you sure it's them?" I asked, my mind racing. "I can't say for sure without seeing the paperwork," she admitted, "but I wouldn't be surprised. That neighborhood's a gold mine, and those buyers have been circling for a while now." I thanked her for the heads up, feeling a mix of gratitude and dread. She offered to help if I needed advice or guidance, and I promised to send her the details as soon as I could. As I walked back to my office, Rachel's words replayed in my head. The idea that my parents might have been taken advantage of made my stomach churn. They weren't naive, but their desperation to help Claire might have clouded their judgment. And if Rachel was right about these buyers, they wouldn't hesitate to exploit that. By the time I got back to my desk, I'd made up my mind. I needed to dig deeper. That evening, I called my mom under the pretense of wanting an update on the sale. "Hey, Mom," I said casually, "how's everything going with the house? Did you finalize the deal yet?" "Not yet," she replied. "The buyers are still working on the paperwork, but they've been really helpful. They said they'd handle everything to make it as easy as possible for us." Red flags immediately went up in my mind. "Did you get a second opinion on their offer?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Well, no," she admitted. "We didn't want to waste time shopping around. They seemed really eager to close the deal, and we didn't want to drag it out." I clenched my jaw, trying to mask my frustration. "Okay," I said, forcing a smile into my voice. "Do you think you could send me the details? Just so I can see what's going on?" She hesitated, but eventually agreed. "Sure, sweetie. But don't stress yourself out over it. Okay, we got it under control." When the documents arrived in my inbox later that night, it didn't take long to confirm my suspicions. The offer was well below what the house was worth, even with a quick sale. The buyers had framed it as a fair deal, emphasizing the convenience of their process and the speed at which they could close. But it was clear they were banking on my parents not knowing any better. I forwarded the documents to Rachel immediately, along with a desperate plea for her insight. She responded the next morning with a curt but damning reply. "You're right. They're undervaluing it by at least 15%, maybe more. This deal is bad news." My heart sank. The thought of my parents losing such a significant piece of our family's history and being taken advantage of in the process was unbearable. I knew I couldn't let this happen. Fueled by equal parts anger and determination, I started piecing together a plan. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew I couldn't let the deal go through without a fight. My parents might have been too trusting, and Claire might have been too desperate, but I wasn't going to stand by and let this become another story of regret. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a purpose. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready to do whatever it took to protect the house and my family from making a decision they'd come to regret. The more I dug into the details of the sale, the angrier I became. Rachel's warning had been right on the money, literally. The buyers had made a lowball offer, one that was significantly below the market value of the house. Worse, their tactics were straight out of a predatory playbook. They'd emphasized the convenience of a quick sale, painted a grim picture of the market, and framed themselves as my parents' best option. The manipulation was obvious to me, but it wasn't hard to see why my parents had fallen for it. They were under immense pressure to help Claire, and the buyers had exploited that vulnerability perfectly. When I called Rachel to confirm my suspicions, her response was as blunt as it was infuriating. "This is textbook," she said. "They target people who don't know the market and who feel like they're running out of time. Your parents are exactly the kind of sellers they prey on." I was furious, not just at the buyers, but at my parents too. How could they have been so naive? How could they not see that they were being taken advantage of? But as the initial wave of anger subsided, I realized that blaming them wouldn't solve anything. They'd acted out of love for Claire, and they genuinely thought they were doing the right thing. What I needed now wasn't outrage. It was a plan. I stayed up late that night, staring at my laptop trying to figure out my next move. The idea of stopping the sale outright seemed like a long shot. My parents were set on their decision, and the deal was already in motion. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way to change the outcome. That's when it hit me. I could put together an offer of my own. The thought seemed ridiculous at first. I didn't have the kind of money it would take to match the buyer's offer, let alone outbid them. But the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I didn't need to go it alone. I had resources, connections, and people who believed in me. The first person I called was Rachel. "I'm thinking about making an offer," I said, the words spilling out in a rush. "I don't know how, but I can't just let this happen. Can you help me figure out what it would take?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. But you need to move fast. The longer this drags out, the harder it's going to be to stop the sale." We spent the next hour brainstorming. Rachel helped me estimate a fair offer price, factoring in the house's true market value and the emotional weight it carried for my family. She also gave me advice on financing options, pointing me toward a few connections who might be able to help. The next step was figuring out how to approach my parents. I knew I couldn't just march in and demand they take my offer. It would only make them defensive. I needed to frame it as a solution, a way to keep the house in the family, while still helping Claire. I called them the next day, doing my best to sound calm and reasonable. "I've been looking into the sale." I began carefully. "And I think there might be a better way to handle this." "What do you mean?" my dad asked, his tone wary. "I mean, the offer you've accepted. It's not fair. The buyers are undervaluing the house, and you're losing more than you realize. But I think I can help. I've been working on putting together an offer of my own." There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, my mom spoke. "An offer? From you?" "Sweetie, that's not necessary. We've already made our decision." "It is necessary," I insisted, my voice firm but not harsh. "This house isn't just a house. It's part of our family. I know you're doing this to help Claire, but there's a way to do that without losing something so important." I could hear my dad sigh. "You don't understand how tight things are," he said. "We don't have time to play around with new offers. The buyers are ready to close, and we need the money now." "I do understand," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "And that's why I'm doing this. I'm not trying to make things harder for you. I'm trying to give you a way out that doesn't leave you with regrets." They didn't commit to anything that night, but I could tell my words had planted a seed. Over the next few days, I worked nonstop to pull everything together. I reached out to a financial advisor to explore loan options, called in favors from friends who could help with the paperwork, and leaned on Rachel for guidance every step of the way. It was exhausting. and there were moments when I doubted whether it would all come together in time. But I kept reminding myself of why I was doing this. The house wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of everything my family had built together. Losing it would mean losing a piece of ourselves, and I wasn't ready to let that happen. When I finally submitted my offer, it felt like a leap of faith. I didn't know if it would be enough to convince my parents, or if the buyers would try to fight back. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to back down without a fight. This was about more than just the house. It was about protecting the heart of our family, even when the odds seemed stacked against us. The day of the closing meeting arrived, and my nerves were shot. I'd spent the last week preparing for this moment, going over every detail of my plan, but now that it was here, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what was at stake. This wasn't just about a piece of property. It was about standing up for something that mattered, about protecting the heart of my family. I arrived at the office where the meeting was being held 15 minutes early, my folder of documents tucked under one arm. The receptionist looked at me curiously, but I kept my explanation vague. "I'm here for the meeting about the Elm Street property," I said with a polite smile. When she ushered me into the room, the tension was immediate. My parents were seated at the table, their expressions shifting from surprise to confusion as they saw me. Across from them sat the buyers, two men in expensive suits who exuded an air of smug confidence. "Sorry for the interruption," I said as I stepped inside. "But I have something that needs to be addressed before you finalize anything." My dad was the first to speak, his voice laced with concern. "What are you doing here? This isn't the time for—" I held up a hand to stop him. "I promise this won't take long. But before you sign anything, you need to see this." I walked to the head of the table and placed a folder in front of the buyers. One of them, a man with slicked back hair and a smirk that made my skin crawl, raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "My name is irrelevant," I said evenly. "What matters is what's in that folder." The other buyer, slightly older and less smug, picked up the folder and began flipping through the documents inside. His expression was neutral at first, but as he read on, his eyebrows knitted together in a frown. The younger man leaned over to glance at the papers, and soon his smirk disappeared entirely. "What is this?" the younger buyer demanded, his tone suddenly defensive. "It's a counteroffer," I said, crossing my arms. "One that reflects the true value of the property." My parents exchanged stunned glances, clearly unsure of how to react. The buyers, however, were visibly annoyed. "This is highly irregular," the older buyer said, closing the folder and placing it on the table. "We already have a deal in place. The terms are agreed upon. Nothing is final until the papers are signed," I countered. "And from what I can see, you've been trying to take advantage of my parents. You've undervalued this property by at least 15%, probably more, and pressured them into thinking this was their best option. That ends today." The younger buyer leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Do you even have the resources to back this offer? Or is this some kind of stunt?" I smiled, though my heart was pounding. "Every detail is outlined in that folder," I said calmly. "I've secured financing, and I'm prepared to close as soon as possible. This isn't a stunt. It's a solution." The room was silent for a moment, the tension so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out. Finally, the older buyer leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Your offer is compelling," he admitted grudgingly. "But this puts us in a difficult position. We've already invested time and resources into this deal." "That's not my problem," I replied, my tone firm. "You came here to take advantage of my parents, but now you have a choice. Accept my offer and walk away, or risk being exposed for your predatory tactics. Either way, you're not walking out of here with this house." The younger buyer opened his mouth to argue, but the older man shot him a warning look. "We'll need some time to review this," he said finally. "You have until the end of the day," I said. "After that, my offer is off the table." As the buyers exchanged quiet words, I turned my attention to my parents. My mom looked like she was on the verge of tears, and my dad's face was a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. Pride, maybe? "You didn't have to do this," my dad said quietly. "Yes, I did," I replied, my voice softening. "This house means too much to let it go like this. You deserve better, and so does Claire. I know you were trying to help her, but there's a way to do that without sacrificing everything we've built." My mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. By the end of the meeting, the buyers had no choice but to accept my terms. Their predatory tactics had been exposed, and they knew they wouldn't come out on top if they tried to push back. As I walked out of the office that day, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The battle wasn't over yet. There were still details to finalize and conversations to be had. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd taken control of the situation. The house wasn't just a piece of property. It was a part of my family, a symbol of everything we'd been through together. And now, thanks to one chance encounter and a lot of determination, it was staying right where it belonged. The moment the buyers left the room, the silence was deafening. My parents sat frozen, staring at me like they couldn't quite process what had just happened. The folder with my counteroffer lay open on the table. The papers inside shuffled and marked with the hastily scrawled notes of the buyers as they tried to salvage their losing position. My dad was the first to break the silence. "Why didn't you tell us you were doing this?" he asked, his voice low, but shaking with a mix of frustration and disbelief. I met his gaze, knowing I needed to tread carefully. "Because I knew you wouldn't let me," I said, my tone firm but calm. "You've already made up your minds, and you thought this was the only way to help Claire. But it's not. You don't have to sell it to them. Sell it to me?" My mom blinked, tears still clinging to the corners of her eyes. "Sweetie, we didn't even know you had the resources to do something like this." "How?" "I leveraged everything," I interrupted. "Savings, loans, and help from people who believed in me. It wasn't easy, but I made it work because this house means too much to let it go like this. You're being taken advantage of, and I couldn't just stand by and watch." My dad leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You went behind our backs," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Because you didn't give me a choice," I shot back, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "You decided to sell the house without even telling me. Do you know how that felt? To find out secondhand that the one place we all called home was going to be gone forever." His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, I saw the exhaustion in his face. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he said quietly. We thought you'd understand." My mom reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "We were trying to protect you," she said, her voice trembling. "You've always been the strong one. Claire, she's different. She needs help in ways you don't. We didn't want to burden you with this." "I get that," I said, softening my tone. "I do. But selling the house to those buyers wasn't the answer. It was a rushed decision made under pressure, and it would have left you with nothing but regret." They didn't say anything, but I could tell they were listening. Just then, my dad sighed heavily and shook his head. "So, what's your plan? You buy the house, and then what? How does that help Claire?" I took a deep breath, grateful for the chance to explain. "If I buy the house, it stays in the family. You get the funds you need to help Claire, but we don't lose the place that means so much to all of us. I'll cover the expenses, and you don't have to worry about the buyers lowballing you anymore." For a long moment, no one spoke. I could see the gears turning in my dad's head, his pragmatic side warring with the emotions tied to the house. My mom, meanwhile, seemed torn between relief and guilt. "This doesn't feel right," she said finally. "It feels like we're putting all of this on you now. We're supposed to be the ones taking care of you, not the other way around." "You did take care of me," I said gently. "For years. And now it's my turn to help. Please, let me do this." My dad looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something, reassurance, maybe, or conviction. Whatever he saw must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "We'll sell it to you." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't going to be easy, and I knew there would still be hard conversations to have, especially with Claire. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. The next hour was a flurry of logistics as we began sorting out the details. My parents were hesitant at first, still grappling with the sudden change in plans, but their trust in me seemed to grow with every question I answered and every assurance I gave. By the time we left the office, the original deal with the buyers was officially dead. The house was staying in the family, and I was now the one negotiating its future. As we stepped outside, my mom turned to me and gave me a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." My dad stood off to the side, watching us with a thoughtful expression. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then I guess it's time to move forward." And with that, we headed home, together for the first time in what felt like forever. After the whirlwind of the closing meeting, my parents insisted that we sit down and talk. They weren't ready to let everything that had happened sink into the background just yet. And honestly, neither was I. We went back to the house, our house, for what felt like the first time in years with a sense of purpose, though the tension in the air was palpable. The moment we stepped through the door, my dad turned to me, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What the hell were you thinking?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Going behind our backs like that? You blindsided us. My mom, usually the peacekeeper, chimed in. We're grateful for what you've done, but this wasn't your decision to make. You had no right to step in without telling us. I took a deep breath, bracing myself. Their anger was justified, but I knew I had to make them understand why I'd done what I did. You're right, I said, keeping my tone steady. I should have told you, but I didn't because I knew you wouldn't listen. That stopped them both in their tracks. They exchanged glances, their indignation faltering just enough for me to continue. I'm not trying to undermine you, I said, looking at each of them in turn. I just couldn't stand by and watch you lose the house for less than it's worth. This place means too much, not just to me, but to all of us. And the deal you were about to sign? It wasn't fair. They were taking advantage of you, and I couldn't let that happen. My dad shook his head, still visibly grappling with the situation. We were trying to do what we thought was best, he said, his voice softer now. We were trying to help Claire. You think we wanted to sell the house? We didn't. But what choice did we have? You had me, I replied. You always had me, but you didn't even give me a chance to help. You made this decision without me, and then you expected me to just accept it. I couldn't do that, Dad. I had to step in because no one else was going to. My mom sighed, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs. We didn't want to burden you, she said, her voice trembling. You have your own life, your own responsibilities. This wasn't supposed to fall on you, but it did, I said gently, because this is my family too. And if that means stepping up when things get hard, then that's what I'll do. I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. You don't have to shield me from everything. She wiped at her eyes, nodding slowly. My dad, meanwhile, was staring out the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Finally, he turned back to me. So, what now, he asked. You've made your point, and you've made your offer. What happens next? I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. Now, we make it official, I said. You sell the house to me, and we figure out a way to help Claire that doesn't involve losing the one thing that ties this family together. I know it's not what you planned, but it's the best option we have. My dad didn't respond immediately, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was a practical man, and while he hated being blindsided, he also couldn't deny the logic of what I was saying. My mom was the first to break the silence. It's not just about the house, she said softly. It's about Claire. She's in such a bad place right now, and I don't know if this is enough to save her. I know, I said, but this is a start. We help her get back on her feet, and we make sure she has the tools she needs to stay there. Selling the house might have solved one problem, but it wouldn't have fixed a bigger issue. Claire needs more than just money. She needs support, guidance, and accountability. And we can give her that without losing everything else. By the end of the conversation, the tension in the room had eased. My parents weren't thrilled about how everything had played out, but they were starting to see the bigger picture. They agreed, reluctantly at first, to sell the house to me, though it was clear the decision was as emotional as it was practical. Are you sure about this? My dad asked one last time. This is a big responsibility, and once it's done, there's no going back. I'm sure, I said without hesitation. This house means everything to me. I'll do whatever it takes to keep it, and to help this family move forward. My mom hugged me tightly, and even my dad gave me a small, approving nod. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were all on the same page. As I left the kitchen that night, I glanced around the house, taking in the familiar sights and sounds that had shaped my childhood. It wasn't just a building. It was a piece of our family's soul. And now it was staying right where it belonged. When Claire found out what I'd done, her reaction was exactly as I'd feared. Anger, confusion, and a hefty dose of guilt masked by indignation. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, her expression a mixture of hurt and frustration. What the hell? My name, she said the moment I opened the door. Mom and Dad told me everything. You just swoop in, throw your money around, and make decisions like you know what's best for everyone. I gestured for her to come inside, bracing myself for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. Claire, I didn't swoop in, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. I stepped in because the situation was spiraling out of control. They were about to sell the house for way less than it was worth. All because they were desperate to help you. Her eyes narrowed, but she sat down on the edge of the couch, arms crossed defensively. I didn't ask them to do that, she snapped. I didn't ask for any of this. That's the problem, I replied, sitting across from her. You didn't ask, but you still let them do it. You've been in trouble before, and instead of finding a way to fix it, you let Mom and Dad shoulder the burden. This time, it almost cost us the house. The one place that's meant everything to this family. Claire looked away, her jaw tightening. I could see the guilt creeping into her expression, but she wasn't ready to admit it yet. "You don't get it," she said after a moment, her voice softer now. "I didn't mean for things to get so bad. I thought I could handle it. I really did, but everything just kept piling up, and before I knew it, I was drowning." I sighed, leaning forward. "I do get it, Claire. Life is hard, and sometimes it feels impossible to keep your head above water. But letting everyone else clean up your messes isn't the answer. I didn't step in to punish you. I did it because I care about you. But this has to stop." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then Claire's defenses seemed to crumble, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't deserve this," she said, her voice muffled. "I've been such a mess, and you've done nothing but clean up after me. You're always the responsible one, the one who has it all together. And I hate myself for dragging everyone down." I moved to sit beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's not about what you deserve," I said gently. "It's about family. We're all trying to help you because we love you, not because you've earned it or haven't. But Claire, this can't keep happening. You need to figure out a way to take care of yourself. I can't do it for you, and neither can Mom and Dad." She looked up at me, her eyes red and brimming with tears. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "Start small," I said. "Talk to a financial advisor. Set a budget. Take it one step at a time. And if you need support, we'll be here for you. But you have to take the lead. This is your life, Claire. No one else can live it for you." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I'll try," she said. "I really will." That was all I could ask for, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope that things might actually change. Claire still had a long road ahead of her, but at least she was willing to take the first step. Over the next few weeks, Claire started making small but meaningful changes. She scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor, cut back on unnecessary expenses, and even started looking for a second job to help pay down her debts. It wasn't a perfect transformation. There were still moments of frustration and setbacks, but it was progress. As for my parents, their trust in me seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. My dad, who had initially struggled with the idea of selling the house to me, started involving me in more family decisions. My mom, meanwhile, seemed relieved to finally share the emotional weight of everything that had happened. The house, now officially mine, remained a symbol of our family's resilience. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a reminder of the lengths we were willing to go to for each other, even when things got tough. One evening, as we sat around the dining table for the first family dinner in months, my dad raised his glass. "To moving forward," he said, "and to sticking together, no matter what." We all clinked glasses, smiling at one another. It wasn't perfect, and it might never be, but we were finally on the same page. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we weren't just rebuilding trust. We were rebuilding the family we'd almost lost. As the dust settled on everything that had happened, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short period of time. The house was still standing, a beacon of stability amidst the chaos that had threatened to unravel my family. But more than that, it had become a symbol of something deeper, a reminder of what we'd fought for and why. Keeping the house hadn't been easy. It required difficult conversations, sacrifices, and a willingness to challenge the very people I loved most. My parents, initially hurt by my intervention, had come to understand that my actions weren't meant to undermine them, but to protect them, and all of us. For Claire, the journey was far from over, but she was moving forward. She'd taken real steps to address her financial situation, meeting regularly with a financial advisor and sticking to a budget for the first time in years. There were setbacks, of course, but each time she stumbled, she picked herself back up, determined to keep going. One of the most surprising developments was the way the house brought us closer together as a family. My parents, who had always seen themselves as the anchors of the household, started to lean on me more, acknowledging that I was no longer the child they'd once needed to protect. It was a shift I hadn't realized I craved until it happened, a newfound sense of mutual respect that made me feel more connected to them than ever. Family dinners became a regular occurrence again, and they carried a different energy now. There was laughter, sure, but also honesty and openness that had been missing for years. We talked about the hard stuff, about the struggles we'd faced, and the mistakes we'd made. And through it all, the house stood as a silent witness, the walls holding the weight of every word, every shared moment, every step toward healing. Claire joined us at those dinners, too, her presence a little tentative at first. I could tell she still carried guilt for the role she'd played in the chaos, but bit by bit, she started to relax. She shared updates on her progress, celebrated small victories, and even cracked a few jokes at her own expense. For me, keeping the house wasn't just about preserving memories. It was about reclaiming a sense of control. For so long, I'd felt like I was stuck in a passive role, watching life happen around me without a say in how it unfolded. Stepping up for my family, even when it was uncomfortable, had reminded me of my own strength. The house itself became a project of its own. I took on renovations here and there, updating the kitchen, repainting the bedrooms, and fixing the little things that had been neglected over the years. Each improvement felt like an investment not just in the property, but in the legacy of our family. My parents were hesitant at first to accept help with the upkeep, but eventually they came around. My dad even started joining me for weekend projects, teaching me skills he'd picked up over the years. Those afternoons in the backyard, hammering nails and swapping stories, became some of my favorite moments. The house didn't just stand as a physical structure. It held lessons. Lessons about resilience, about communication, and about the messiness of family. It taught us that even when things fall apart, they can be put back together with enough effort, enough love, and enough determination to do what's right. Looking back, I'm grateful for the chaos that forced us to confront these truths. Without it, we might never have had the chance to grow in the ways we did. And as for me, I've never been more thankful for the strength to stand up for what matters most. The experience taught me that family is complicated, imperfect, and often frustrating, but it's also worth fighting for. Today, the house stands as a testament to that fight. It's not just a home. It's a reminder of the bonds we've mended, the lessons we've learned, and the love that has always been at the heart of it all. And as I walk through its familiar halls, I know one thing for certain. We're moving forward together.